The sleek, angular warship drifted in orbit above the ruined planet of Loxis 9, its surface scarred by craters and scorched wastelands. Alien soldier Yren stood rigidly in the dimly lit brig, her twin hearts thudding in unison with a dissonance she hadn't felt since her first deployment. Before her, encased in a faintly glowing energy field, sat the human prisoner. His breathing was calm, his eyes unwavering as they met hers, a silent defiance written across his scarred face. Yren narrowed her slitted eyes and studied him, her three-fingered hands resting against the console that controlled his containment. The field hummed faintly, a soft, insistent buzz like a barrier against her doubts. He was the first human she had ever encountered alive. "Speak," she commanded, her voice as sharp and clipped as her language allowed. She stood taller than him, her lean figure clad in the polished black armor of the Zalkri Dominion, a military empire that had subjugated dozens of planets and reduced countless species to servitude. "What were you doing in our sector?" The human leaned back against the metallic bench, as if testing the energy field around him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the infuriating calm of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Scouting," he said simply. "That's what pilots do." His words were untranslatable into her native tongue, but the universal translator embedded in her neural pathways rendered them in perfect clarity. His tone, however, needed no translation. It was laced with mockery. "Scouting for what?" she snapped, her tone darkening. "Survival," he replied. "Humans are pretty good at that, if you hadn't noticed." Yren's ridged brow furrowed. Survival? Was that not the excuse every species used when they encroached upon Zalkri territory? She had been trained to see such claims as cowardice, as justification for weakness. And yet, there was something in his tone that gnawed at her resolve. "Your survival," she said coldly, "ends here, human. You were caught trespassing in restricted space. My commanders will interrogate you, and when they have wrung every scrap of information from you, you will be discarded." She expected him to flinch, to beg, to display the inferiority that the Dominion's propaganda had drilled into her since her hatching. But he did none of those things. Instead, he laughed. It was a low, rasping sound, but it carried an unnerving confidence. "Discarded," he repeated, shaking his head. "You make it sound so clinical, but I've seen how your kind handles discards. You don't scare me, alien." "Alien." The word landed like a blow. She bristled, her spine shoulders stiffening, though she could not fully explain why. She was the captor. He was the captive. Yet the calm in his voice unsettled her, as though he were the one observing her. "You think yourself brave," she said, stepping closer to the field, her voice a low hiss. "But your bravery is meaningless. It will not save you. It will not change anything," he interrupted, his gaze locking onto hers. "You're right. It won't. Just like your loyalty to this empire of yours won't change the fact that you're nothing but a cog in their machine." Yren's hand twitched toward the control panel, a sharp spike of anger rising in her chest. She could deactivate the field, strike him, show him the price of insolence. But something in his words froze her. A cog in their machine. She knew better than to let the words of a prisoner burrow into her thoughts, yet they lingered, like a sliver beneath her carapace. Her loyalty to the Dominion was absolute, or so she had always believed. Yet as the human stared at her, his expression one of quiet defiance rather than terror, a crack began to form in the armor of her conviction. "You know nothing of the Dominion," she said finally, her voice softer, almost defensive. "We bring order to chaos. Without us, the galaxy would tear itself apart." The human raised an eyebrow. "Order? Huh? You call this order? Kidnapping, subjugation, extermination? Funny, where I come from, we have a different word for it." "And what word is that?" "Empire." The simplicity of the word struck her like a blow. Yren had heard it before. Of course, spoken in anger, spat like a curse by the conquered. But hearing it from this human, spoken so calmly, so deliberately, planted a seed of doubt in her mind that she could not easily uproot. The hours stretched into days. Yren continued her duties, monitoring the human, interrogating him, probing for weaknesses. But as their conversations deepened, they became something she had not anticipated: dialogues. Each time she entered the brig, the human would greet her with a sardonic remark or a pointed question, and against her better judgment, she began to respond. "What do you think you're accomplishing with all this?" she asked one day, pacing outside the energy field as he leaned back against the bench, arms folded. "I could ask you the same thing," he replied. "What are you accomplishing, keeping me here? Your superiors will get what they want from me eventually, or kill me trying. Either way, you're just the messenger, right? Following orders." "I am a soldier," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I follow orders because it is my duty. Without duty, there is chaos." The human tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Funny thing about duty," he said. "It has a way of blinding you to the truth. Let me guess, they told you humans are savages, right? Mindless killers? Monsters?" Yren's mandibles clicked together. "And are you not? Do I look like a monster to you?" She hesitated. The propaganda she had been fed her entire life painted humans as brutish, primitive beings, incapable of higher thought or morality. But the man before her, wounded, unarmed, and yet utterly unbroken, did not fit that image. He was calculating, intelligent, and infuriatingly resilient. "You look stubborn," she said finally, the admission tasting strange on her tongue. He laughed again, the sound softer this time. "I'll take that as a compliment." Their conversations continued, becoming less adversarial and more probing. Yren found herself drawn to his perspective, even as it conflicted with everything she had been taught. He spoke of Earth, of its beauty and chaos, its resilience and flaws. He described the vast oceans, the sprawling cities, the endless skies unbroken by orbital warships. And he spoke of freedom, a concept that resonated with her in ways she could not fully explain. "Why do you fight for them?" he asked one day, his tone quieter than usual. "The Dominion. Why do you give them your loyalty?" "Because they gave me purpose," she replied, though the words felt hollow. "They taught me discipline. They saved me." "Saved you from what?" She hesitated. The question cut deeper than it should have. "From nothing. It doesn't matter." "It does matter," he insisted, leaning forward, his expression earnest. "You don't have to keep fighting for them, you know? You don't owe them your life." Yren stared at him, her twin hearts beating faster. The idea was absurd. To defy the Dominion was to invite death. Yet as she looked at the human, his eyes filled with a determination that bordered on hope, she felt the weight of her own chains pressing down on her. Chains she had never noticed until now. The crack in her conviction widened, and for the first time in her life, Yren began to wonder if her loyalty to the Dominion was not strength, but fear. Fear of questioning, fear of defiance, fear of freedom. But could she risk it? Could she abandon everything she had ever known, everything she had fought for? And most importantly, could she trust this human, the prisoner who had somehow become her confidant? She didn't know, but she was beginning to suspect that he did. Yren lingered in the brig that evening longer than she had intended. She wasn't supposed to stay here when her shifts were over. Protocol demanded that interactions with prisoners be brief, impersonal, and strictly professional. But protocol, much like her allegiance to the Dominion, had begun to feel fragile. The human, he had finally told her his name, Caleb, sat with his back against the wall of his cell, gazing at her with that maddeningly calm expression that made him seem more like a teacher addressing a wayward pupil than a prisoner awaiting interrogation. Yren hated that she felt a strange comfort in the way he looked at her, as though he saw through her armor, both literal and figurative, and understood the turmoil within. "You're quiet today," Caleb said, breaking the silence. He tilted his head slightly, his expression curious. "What's on your mind?" Yren stiffened. "I am not here to engage in idle conversation with you," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. But as the words left her mouth, she knew they were a lie. She was here for conversation, drawn by some inexplicable need to hear his voice, to challenge and be challenged by his words. Caleb didn't flinch at her tone. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're not as heartless as you want me to think," he said. "If you were, you wouldn't still be standing here." Yren's mandibles clicked in irritation. She turned away, pretending to examine the control panel on the wall, though she already knew every light and glyph on its surface. "You overestimate your importance," she said. "I am merely studying you." "Studying me?" Caleb echoed, an amused smile creeping onto his face. "Is that what you're calling it?" Yren whipped around, her elongated pupils narrowing into slits. "Do not mistake my curiosity for weakness, human." "I don't," Caleb said softly, the humor fading from his expression. "But I think you mistake yourself for something you're not." The word struck like a blow, though Yren wasn't sure why. She stepped closer to the energy field, her spined shoulders stiffening as she loomed over him. "And what do you think I am, human?" Caleb met her gaze unflinchingly. "I think you're someone who knows this isn't right," he said. "All of it, this empire, this war, this prison. It doesn't sit right with you. And it's eating you up inside, whether you admit it or not." For a long moment, Yren said nothing. Her twin hearts hammered against her ribs, and she hated how his words seemed to pierce through every layer of armor she had built around herself. She wanted to dismiss him, to call him a fool, to remind him that he was the one trapped behind an energy field, not her. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down, she knew he was right. That night, Yren found herself standing on one of the observation decks of the warship, staring out at the ruined surface of Loxis, 9 below. The planet had once been a thriving hub of trade and culture, its cities glittering like jewels against the blackness of space. But the Dominion had deemed it a threat, and so it had been reduced to ash and rubble. Yren had been part of the invasion force. She remembered the orders, delivered in the cold, precise tones of her commanding officer. No survivors. No mercy. The Dominion does not tolerate resistance. She had followed those orders without question. She had stormed the cities, her plasma rifle cutting down civilians who begged for their lives in languages she didn't understand. She had watched entire families dragged from their homes and loaded onto transport ships bound for labor camps on distant worlds. At the time, she had felt nothing. It was her duty, her purpose. And yet now, as she stared at the lifeless planet below, the memory filled her with a sense of unease she couldn't shake. "You've been standing here for a while," a voice said behind her. Yren turned sharply, her hand instinctively reaching for the blade at her side. But it was only Captain Dravok, his broad, hulking frame silhouetted against the doorway. His crimson armor gleamed in the faint light, the emblem of the Dominion etched into his chest plate. "Captain," Yren said, straightening, "I was reflecting on the mission." Dravok stepped closer, his heavy footsteps echoing in the empty chamber. His eyes, dark and piercing, studied her with a scrutiny that made her uncomfortable. "Is that all you were doing?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. Yren hesitated. "Yes, sir." Dravok grunted, though whether in approval or doubt, she couldn't tell. "You've been spending a great deal of time with the human prisoner," he said, his voice low and deliberate. Yren's heart skipped a beat. "I am conducting interrogations as ordered," she said carefully. Dravok's gaze bore into her. "Interrogations that have yielded no actionable intelligence," he said. "The commanders are growing impatient. If you cannot extract information from him soon, he will be dealt with." Yren's mandibles twitched. "I understand, sir." "Do you?" Dravok stepped closer, his towering presence casting a long shadow over her. "The Dominion does not tolerate failure, Yren, or disloyalty." The unspoken threat hung in the air like a blade poised to strike. Yren forced herself to meet his gaze, her voice steady despite the storm raging within her. "I am loyal to the Dominion," she said. Dravok studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "See that you remain so," he said. "The human's execution is scheduled for the next cycle. If you wish to extract anything useful from him, I suggest you do it quickly." Yren watched as he turned and strode out of the chamber, the door hissing shut behind him. She stood there for a long time, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a physical force. The next cycle, that was all the time she had. When Yren returned to the brig, Caleb was sitting exactly as she had left him, his posture relaxed despite the circumstances. He looked up as she entered, and his expression softened when he saw the tension in her face. "Let me guess," he said. "The big guy's breathing down your neck?" Yren didn't respond. She stepped closer to the energy field, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. "Caleb," she said, her voice low. "They're going to kill you." He nodded, as though he had already resigned himself to that fate. "I figured as much," he said. "They've got to make an example of me, right? Can't have a lowly human undermining their big, scary empire." "You don't understand," Yren said, her voice rising slightly. I can't stop it. Not unless—" "Unless what?" Caleb asked, leaning forward. Yren hesitated. The words burned on her tongue, dangerous and treasonous. But there was no time for doubt, no time for caution. If she didn't act now, it would be too late. "Unless I help you escape," she said. Caleb's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't speak. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the energy field. "You do that?" he asked finally, his voice quiet but filled with something that sounded like hope. Yren took a deep breath, her hearts pounding in unison. "I don't know if I can," she admitted. "But if I don't, you'll die. And I can't." She broke off, her throat tightening. Caleb smiled faintly. "Yren," he said, his voice steady. "If you do this, there's no going back. Are you sure you're ready for that?" She looked at him, the human who had become so much more than her prisoner, and for the first time, she felt something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear, or anger, or even duty. It was something far more dangerous. It was freedom. "I'm ready," she said. Yren had made her decision, but she hadn't yet come to terms with it. As she left the brig that night, her thoughts churned like the turbulent storms of Ventrix, the homeworld she had not seen in years. Every instinct, every fiber of her being screamed at her to stop, to step back into line, to obey. And yet, as the cold corridors of the warship stretched out before her, she realized that something within her had shifted, something she could not reverse. The Dominion was no longer the unshakable monolith she had believed it to be. Its power, its order, now felt hollow, like a vast machine grinding forward without purpose, crushing everything in its path. And now, she was part of that machine no longer. The plan. Yren spent the following hours in restless preparation. She pored over the ship's schematics, memorizing patrol routes and security checkpoints. The Dominion warship, the Obsidian Wrath, was a fortress in space, its corridors bristling with surveillance systems and patrolling guards. Escaping undetected would be impossible. But Yren wasn't aiming for stealth. She was counting on speed, misdirection, and sheer audacity. When her shift ended, she returned to her quarters, where she pulled open a hidden compartment in the wall. Inside was a small cache of equipment she had accumulated over the years, tools, spare power cells, and a few contraband items she had acquired from previous missions. Among them was an unauthorized override chip designed to bypass security protocols. She had never intended to use it, at least, not for treason, but now it would be her lifeline. The next cycle came too quickly. Yren reported to the brig as usual, but this time, every step felt heavier than the last. The weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her, a suffocating pressure that threatened to crush her resolve. When she entered the brig, Caleb was already waiting. He sat cross-legged on the floor of his cell, his eyes closed, as if meditating. The faint hum of the energy field filled the air, a reminder of the invisible barrier that separated them. "You're late," he said without opening his eyes. Yren stepped closer, her armor clinking softly. "I had preparations to make," she said. Caleb opened his eyes and looked up at her, his expression calm but curious. "Preparations for what?" "For this," Yren said, and with a swift motion, she deactivated the energy field. The hum ceased, and Caleb blinked in surprise as the shimmering barrier dissolved. He remained seated, watching her with cautious curiosity. "So, you're really doing it," he said. Yren extended a hand to him. "Get up," she said. "We don't have much time." Caleb hesitated for only a moment before taking her hand. His grip was firm, his skin warm against her clawed fingers. As she pulled him to his feet, she noticed the faint smile that flickered across his face. "I didn't think you'd actually go through with it," he said. "I didn't think I would either," Yren admitted. "But here we are." She handed him a small device, a stun baton she had taken from the armory. It was primitive compared to the weapons the guards carried, but it would be enough to defend himself if necessary. "Stick close to me," Yren said, her voice low but firm, "and do exactly as I say. If we're caught—" "I know," Caleb interrupted. "It's over." Yren nodded. "Good. Let's move." The escape. The corridors of the Obsidian Wrath were dimly lit, the red emergency lights casting long shadows across the metallic walls. Yren led Caleb through a series of maintenance shafts and auxiliary corridors, avoiding the main walkways where patrols were most frequent. She moved with practiced precision, her every step calculated and deliberate. Caleb followed closely, his movements quieter than she expected. For someone who had spent days confined to a cell, he moved with surprising agility, his breathing steady and controlled. As they approached the first checkpoint, Yren held up a hand, signaling Caleb to stop. She peered around the corner, her enhanced vision scanning the corridor ahead. 2 guards stood at the checkpoint, their plasma rifles held at the ready. "How do we get past them?" Caleb whispered. Yren's mandibles twitched as she considered her options. "We don't," she said. "We go through them." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold plan." "Bold is all we have," Yren said. She handed him a second device, a small spherical object with a blinking light. "It's a flash detonator. When I give the signal, throw it toward them and cover your eyes." Caleb nodded, his expression serious. "Got it." Yren stepped into the corridor, her plasma pistol drawn. The guards immediately raised their weapons, their helmets tilting toward her in surprise. "Soldier Yren," one of them said, "what are you doing here?" "This area is restricted. I'm escorting the prisoner to a secondary holding facility," Yren said, her voice cold and authoritative. "Orders from Captain Dravok." The guards exchanged a glance. "We weren't informed of." "Do you want to explain that to the captain?" Yren snapped, her tone sharp enough to cut. "Because I don't have time to wait for your clearance." The guards hesitated, and Yren saw the doubt flicker in their body language. Before they could respond, she gave a subtle nod to Caleb. The flash detonator sailed through the air, landing at the guard's feet. The moment it detonated, the corridor was filled with a blinding burst of light. The guards staggered, their visors overloaded by the flash, and Yren moved in. With swift, precise movements, she disarmed the first guard, her blade slicing through his weapon's power conduit. Caleb lunged at the second guard, using the stun baton to deliver a crackling blow to his chest plate. The guard collapsed, convulsing as the electrical charge overwhelmed his nervous system. "Not bad," Yren said, glancing at Caleb as the guards lay unconscious on the floor. "Thanks," Caleb said, his breathing slightly heavy. "Been a while since I had to fight for my life." "It shows," Yren said dryly. "Let's keep moving." The hangar. The final leg of their journey brought them to the ship's hangar bay, a cavernous space filled with rows of Dominion fighter craft and transport shuttles. The air was thick with the hum of machinery and the metallic tang of fuel. Yren's plan was simple: steal a shuttle and use its transponder codes to slip past the ship's perimeter defenses. But as they entered the hangar, she realized that simplicity was no guarantee of success. "Guards," Caleb whispered, nodding toward a group of soldiers patrolling near the shuttles. Yren's mind raced. There were too many guards to take out quietly, and a direct confrontation would only draw reinforcements. She scanned the hangar, her gaze landing on a fuel storage unit near one of the shuttles. "If we cause a distraction," she said, "we might be able to slip past them." Caleb followed her gaze. "You're thinking explosion, aren't you?" "Yes," Yren said, "but controlled. We don't want to blow up the whole hangar." "Good to know you have limits," Caleb said with a faint grin. Yren ignored him and handed him another flash detonator. "Set this near the fuel unit, but don't activate it until I give the signal. I'll cover you." Caleb nodded, his expression serious. "Got it." As Caleb moved toward the fuel storage unit, Yren positioned herself behind a stack of crates, her plasma pistol at the ready. Her twin hearts pounded as she watched Caleb slip past the guards, his movements quick and precise. When he reached the storage unit, he glanced back at Yren and gave a subtle nod. She raised her pistol, aiming at a conduit above the guards' heads. The shot rang out, a sharp crack that echoed through the hangar. Sparks rained down as the conduit exploded, drawing the guards' attention away from Caleb. "Now!" Yren shouted. Caleb activated the detonator and tossed it toward the fuel unit. The explosion wasn't large, but it was loud enough to send the guards scrambling for cover. Smoke filled the air, obscuring their vision. "Run!" Yren shouted, and Caleb bolted toward her. Together, they sprinted toward the nearest shuttle. Yren keyed in the override code, and the shuttle's hatch hissed open. They scrambled inside, Yren taking the pilot's seat as Caleb strapped himself into the co-pilot's chair. "Can you fly this thing?" Caleb asked. "Of course," Yren said, her fingers dancing over the controls. "Hold on." The shuttle roared to life, its engines vibrating beneath them. Yren guided it out of the hangar, the ship's automated defenses locking onto them as they passed through the energy barrier. "Brace yourself," Yren said. "This is going to get rough." The shuttle shot into space, the Dominion warship looming behind them like a predator. Alarms blared as the ship's weapons systems came online, plasma turrets swiveling to track their escape. "Any brilliant ideas?" Caleb asked as the first volley of plasma bolts streaked past them. "Just one," Yren said, a determined glint in her eyes. "Don't die." She angled the shuttle toward the planet below, its scorched surface rushing up to meet them. The descent. The shuttle screamed through the black void of space, its engines pushed to their limit. Behind them, the Obsidian Wrath was a hive of activity, its weapons lighting up the darkness with streaks of plasma fire. Yren gritted her teeth, her clawed fingers dancing over the controls as she wove the shuttle through the chaos. Caleb clung to his seat, his knuckles white as he stared out the cockpit window. The planet Loxis, 9 loomed ahead, its ruined surface scarred by war and shrouded in ash storms. It was no sanctuary, but it was their only option. The atmosphere would provide cover from the Dominion sensors if they survived the descent. "Incoming!" Caleb shouted as a plasma bolt grazed the shuttle, sending a shower of sparks through the cockpit. The entire craft shuddered violently, alarms blaring as damage reports flooded the console. Yren hissed in frustration. "Hold on!" she barked, yanking the controls sharply to the left. The shuttle rolled, narrowly avoiding another barrage of plasma fire. But the Dominion wasn't letting up. The Obsidian Wrath launched a squadron of fighters, sleek black ships that streaked toward them like hunting birds. "They're sending fighters now," Caleb said, his voice tight. "We're running out of time." "I see them," Yren snapped, her mind racing. She wasn't a coward, but she wasn't suicidal either. The odds were stacked against them, and she knew it. Yet, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she refused to give up. Not now. Not after coming this far. As the first fighter closed in, Yren slammed a switch on the console, deploying the shuttle's countermeasures. A cloud of chaff and flares erupted behind them, confusing the fighters' targeting systems. The Dominion pilot fired, but the plasma bolts went wide, streaking harmlessly into the void. "Nice trick," Caleb said, gripping the armrests of his seat as the shuttle dipped into Loxis 9's upper atmosphere. The hull groaned under the strain, flames licking at the edges of the cockpit windows. "Let's hope it's enough," Yren said, her voice strained. She angled the shuttle into a steep dive, the ash-choked atmosphere buffeting the craft as they plunged toward the surface. Behind them, the pursuing fighters hesitated at the edge of the planet's atmosphere. The ash storms were too volatile, the winds too fierce for precision piloting. One by one, the fighters peeled away, returning to the safety of the Obsidian Wrath. "We did it," Caleb said, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Not yet," Yren said grimly. The shuttle was still descending too fast, its engines struggling to stabilize. The ruined landscape of Loxis, 9 rushed up to meet them, a wasteland of jagged rocks and smoking craters. Yren fought the controls, her jaw clenched as she wrestled the shuttle into a less suicidal trajectory. "Brace for impact," she shouted. Caleb barely had time to comply before the shuttle slammed into the ground. The impact threw them both against their harnesses, the sound of screeching metal and shattering glass filling the air. The shuttle skidded across the rocky terrain, leaving a deep scar in the earth before finally coming to a halt. A fragile alliance. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the sound of labored breathing filled the cockpit. "You alive?" Yren asked, her voice hoarse. Caleb groaned, unbuckling his harness. "Define alive," he muttered, wincing as he rubbed his shoulder. "But yeah, I think I am." Yren exhaled in relief, leaning back in her seat. Her body ached from the crash, but she ignored the pain. Survival was all that mattered now. "Come on," she said, unbuckling herself and grabbing a small satchel of supplies. "We need to move. The Dominion won't leave us alone for long." Caleb followed her out of the wrecked shuttle, stumbling slightly as his boots hit the uneven ground. The air was thick with ash, the sky a swirling mass of gray and red. The landscape was desolate, dotted with the skeletal remains of buildings and twisted wreckage from past battles. "This place is charming," Caleb said dryly, coughing as he waved away a cloud of ash. "What's the plan?" Yren scanned the horizon, her enhanced vision picking out a jagged ridge in the distance. "There's an old resistance bunker in that direction," she said, pointing. "It should still have supplies, and it's shielded from Dominion sensors." Caleb nodded. "Lead the way." The journey was brutal. The terrain was treacherous, the ground littered with debris and fissures that belched toxic fumes. Yren moved with the efficiency of a soldier, her every step calculated. Caleb, for all his resilience, struggled to keep up, his human physiology ill-suited to the harsh environment. "You're slowing us down," Yren said, glancing over her shoulder. "Thanks for the pep talk," Caleb replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "I'll be sure to work on my alien Deathworld cardio." Despite his complaints, he kept moving, his determination surprising Yren. He was weaker than her, slower, but he didn't give up. She found herself respecting him for it. After hours of walking, they finally reached the bunker. The entrance was hidden beneath a layer of rubble, but Yren's scanners detected the faint energy signature of its shielding system. She cleared the debris with practiced efficiency, revealing a reinforced hatch. "Help me with this," she said, gesturing to Caleb. Together, they pried the hatch open, revealing a dark tunnel that descended into the earth. Yren activated a glow stick, its pale light illuminating the way as they climbed down. The bunker was old but intact. Its walls were lined with crates of supplies, many of them still sealed. Yren quickly set to work, checking for anything useful: food, water, medical supplies, weapons. Caleb sank onto a nearby crate, his exhaustion catching up with him. "So, what now?" he asked, watching as Yren rummaged through the supplies. "Now we survive," Yren said simply. She pulled out a small, rusted communicator and examined it. It was outdated, but it might still work. "I'll try to contact someone outside Dominion space. A smuggler, maybe. Someone who can get us off this planet." "And then?" Caleb pressed. "What happens after we get out of here?" Yren hesitated, her mandibles twitching. She didn't have an answer. The Dominion would hunt her for the rest of her life, branding her a traitor and an outcast. She had no allies, no safe haven to run to. All she had was this human, and a growing sense of uncertainty about her place in the galaxy. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I won't go back. Not after this." Caleb studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Neither will I." The end of fear. As the days passed, Yren and Caleb settled into an uneasy routine. They scavenged the ruins for additional supplies, repaired the bunker's defenses, and worked together to improve their chances of survival. Their conversations grew less guarded, more honest, as they shared pieces of their pasts. Yren learned about Earth, its vibrant chaos and relentless resilience. Caleb learned about the Zalkri Dominion, its iron grip on its people, and the fears that had driven Yren to serve it for so long. In their shared exile, they found a fragile understanding, a connection that neither of them had expected. One night, as they sat outside the bunker, watching the ash storm swirl across the horizon, Caleb turned to Yren. You know, he said, you could have left me back there. Saved yourself a lot of trouble. Yren's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. I could have, she said, but I didn't. Why? She looked at him then, her golden eyes reflecting the faint light of the distant storms. Because you were right, she said. About the Dominion. About me. I've spent my whole life being afraid, of failure, of defiance, of freedom. But you showed me that fear isn't the same as strength. Caleb smiled faintly. Glad I could help. They sat in silence for a while, the storm howling around them. For the first time in years, Yren felt something she hadn't thought possible. Hope. And somewhere, deep in the vast expanse of the galaxy, the Dominion began its hunt. But Yren and Caleb were ready to face it, together.